Okay, so I'm Lai Leong for the SMU Center for Presidential History, and today I'm interviewing Mr. Matthew P. Daley, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the first term of the Bush presidency. Mr. Daley, let's begin with the experience that you brought with you before you were when you were appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary of State.
At the beginning, I had studied political science and international relations, both as an undergraduate and a graduate. I had had roughly 3 years of service in the Army following graduate school, then 5 years with the United States Secret Service as a special agent. Then I joined the State Department in 1976 as a Foreign Service officer and continued in that capacity for roughly 28 years. And during that time I served in Europe, in Turkey, India, a couple tours in Thailand, had many TDY assignments in Southeast Asia, and a number of assignments in the East Asia and Pacific Bureau of the State Department. And that, I think, gave me a reasonably good background in Southeast Asia to serve in the job as Deputy Assistant Secretary. I might also add that at the time, the DAS, who was responsible for Southeast Asia, was also responsible for Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Island states.
So what was a prior appointment just before you became Deputy Assistant Secretary of State?
I'd been in the policy planning staff, working on a variety of issues involving both South Asia, Southeast Asia, and nuclear proliferation.
Okay. Do you speak any of the Southeast Asian languages?
Thai. I speak Thai, Turkish, French, and a smattering of Russian.
Okay, wow. So, broadly speaking then, what were U.S. foreign policy priorities in Southeast Asia, let's say towards the end of the 1990s, just before President Bush came into office?
Well, let me set the stage just a little bit. With the end of the Cold War, there was an unreal period where much of the political debate revolved around the expressions hyperpower, unipolar world. This was accelerated by a desire to cash in on a peace dividend. And I think it's fair to say when the Clinton administration came into office, they were relatively weak on foreign affairs. They were on a steep learning curve, and they were more interested in economic issues, other political objectives to include human rights, religious freedom, issues of trafficking in people, narcotics. They were very active in promoting trade facilitation and expanding our trade agreements with other parts of the world, including NAFTA. And they helped launch the free trade negotiations with both Singapore and Australia that were later concluded during the Bush 43 administration. So at the time the Bush 43 administration came into office, I think there was a judgment that we had neglected our traditional allies and partners. Certainly, for example, in the case of Thailand, there was neglect that bordered on disdain, and that perhaps was a factor in the disgraceful American response to the Thai financial crisis, which was a very sad chapter in our foreign policy history in Southeast Asia, and it had ripple effects throughout the rest of Asia. So when the Bush administration came in, even before 9/11, there was a broad consensus that it was necessary to repair our alliance relationships, not only the traditional security allies where we had treaty relationships, but other countries such as Singapore, which were active partners in a number of concerns. And when that happened, and I may be segueing to your next question about post-9/11, the administration in Southeast Asia did not have major issues with many of the priorities that were pushed by the Clinton administration. 9/11 became a new top foreign policy priority that was set on everything else. But everything else continued to one degree or another. And I think it's fair to say that while some advocacy groups in particular would argue that counterterrorist concerns sucked the oxygen out of the room, nothing fell off the agenda. Arguably, some things did not receive quite the same amount of attention and emphasis as they had done previously, and I think that that would be a fair analysis. But everything continued. And for example, we did conclude the free trade negotiations with Singapore and with Australia. And incidentally, as this interview is being recorded, there's a big question mark over whether President Obama will succeed in getting fast-track negotiating authority for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I find it interesting that so far they've not made the argument that when we did our FTAs with Australia and Singapore, exports went up on both sides, that is both for Singapore, for Australia, and for the United States. But American exports went up relatively more. In other words, if one were to adopt a simplistic winner and loser perspective to it, you would have to say that everybody won but the United States came out ahead. And so I think there is a compelling case to be made for these kinds of agreements if they're done properly.
Mm-hmm. So before we get into 9/11,
right.
So in the lead up to President Bush taking office, you mentioned that there was a sense among some people that there needs to be a recalibration. Who were the leaders, the drivers of that new thinking?
I wouldn't call it new thinking. I would say that if one were to look at the public utterances of people who occupied policy positions in Bush 43, well before the election, you would find concern expressed that we were not paying sufficient attention to our key relationships in the region. Remember that when the Clinton administration came into office, one of the first things they did was to repeat the mistake of the Carter administration by talking about, somewhat recklessly, about pulling American troops out of Korea. And that sort of set the tone for much of the rest of the 8 years. Mm-hmm. And so, well before the election, well before we knew who would, the Florida outcome, people like Armitage, like Powell, Wolfowitz, people who knew Asia well, East Asia well, not just Southeast Asia, and had served in Southeast Asia. I mean, theirs was not simply a passing familiarity. These people were concerned about the direction of policy, and that a re-emphasis on the important relationships was every bit in order. Now that did not exclude developing new relationships. We certainly tried to improve our relationships with Vietnam, with Brunei, with Laos, Cambodia. We even tried with Burma, although we weren't successful.
So some people have characterized, I think, the end of the Clinton administration, that its approach as sort of benign neglect. Was that the feeling?
Well, there was certainly neglect. And sometimes I don't think it was benign. Mm-hmm. I had at least one or two encounters with senior Clinton administration officials visiting Southeast Asia where they exhibited almost a hostility towards a couple of the different Southeast Asian countries because they did not pass their idea of muster in this or that area.
Mm-hmm. What were those areas that they didn't think these countries passed muster in?
Well, they didn't find them sufficiently evolved along the path to democracy. They found that the status of women was sadly lacking, and certainly that was in an area for improvement. But instead of thinking in concrete terms about how to constructively address these shortcomings, there was a hectoring quality to the pronouncements that did not sit well.
So in the first 9 months then of Bush 43, before 9/11, what were the concrete steps that were taken to recalibrate this relationship with Southeast Asia?
Well, the first concrete steps you would have seen were more dialogue with the Asian countries at a senior level and a much more serious dialogue. They were no longer taken for granted. As I say, we continued other aspects of American foreign policy, which were bipartisan in nature. But I think there was, by 9/11, I don't think there was any doubt in Tokyo, in Seoul, in Beijing, about whether things had changed. And it wasn't all a reversion to past practices. For example, you had the Bob Zoellick was very active in crafting the concept of China as a responsible stakeholder. You know, those kinds of efforts of outreach continued. But there was also a very, I think, hard-nosed look at what kind of challenges China would pose to the region and to the United States. Now, these things had not reached fruition by 9/11, because at that point, the administration was still getting its personnel in place.
Sure.
There were a lot of people who had not yet gone through the confirmation process. And because of that, many initiatives were deferred until later.
So speaking to Southeast Asia specifically, and if you could refer to specific countries perhaps, what were the shifts in emphasis for different countries in the first 9 months?
Well, certainly we tried to reinvigorate our security dialogue with Thailand and with Singapore. We were very active in reaching out to Malaysia. The Philippines was kind of an awkward case in a number of respects for the administration to come to grips with, because there were individuals in the administration who did not view with equanimity the decision by the Philippine Senate not to renew or not to ratify the base agreement that we had negotiated. And of course, you may recall that Secretary Armitage was the head of that negotiating team. I guess I should also mention that I was part of that negotiating team myself. So we were grappling with that. We were also grappling with how to deal with Burma. And we can talk about that later. Nothing had come to fruition before 9/11, but you know, that was an area of policy where many, myself included, thought that things were not going well. There was also the beginnings of, you know, pondering about our relationship with New Zealand, but that had not really gelled by the time of 9/11.
In what sense?
New Zealand had been part of the ANZUS Pact, and basically we suspended their participation in ANZUS because of their policy of requiring that any American naval vessel which came into their waters or called at their ports would have to declare whether or not it had nuclear weapons on board. And we had a very firm policy of neither confirm nor deny the presence of nuclear weapons aboard our naval vessels. And some of us felt that adhering to that policy certainly wasn't going to bring the Kiwis on board, that they simply weren't going to change on that. It was part of a quirky political culture, but that there would be other advantages from letting them back into the alliance structure. Those ruminations didn't get very far, because the 800-pound gorilla in the room was our relationship with Japan. And at that time, we did have an aircraft carrier home-ported in Japan, but it was a conventionally powered carrier. And we wanted to replace that with a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. And we judged that the Japanese nuclear allergy did not distinguish neatly between nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed. And so until the transition, that is the transition from basing a conventionally powered aircraft carrier in Japan and a nuclear powered aircraft carrier was well settled in Japanese political culture, there was extreme reluctance to change the relationship we have with New Zealand, lest that create an unfortunate precedent.
What about in terms of the relationship with Australia?
Our relationship with Australia was on the upswing when the Bush administration came into office. John Howard was in many ways a kindred spirit politically. And when we get to 9/11 and the reaction of various countries in the region, I'll return to that particular topic.
Sure. Is it true, though, that in talking about Australia, that in some ways the United States sort of subcontracted out a lot of the intelligence work to them?
I would not say subcontracted. I would say we had a very productive division of labor. We have access to a major facility at a place called Alice Springs in Australia, where Australians and Americans work side by side. And I think it's a mutually beneficial division of labor. I'm not bristling at the term subcontracting, but there are those who, from a political perspective, would say that Australia was our deputy sheriff in the region. And I find that characterization condescending to the Australians, and so I don't like it. So I prefer a more neutral way of looking at things.
But there was a close relationship with
Very
Australia in
close.
terms of intelligence sharing.
Well, in terms of intelligence sharing, and more than intelligence sharing. As a very good down-under friend of mine put it, we came to every war you ever gave. And they did. It's exceptionally close relationship.
Right. I'll come back to Australia in a minute, but to move on to another important country, Indonesia.
Right.
So what was the thinking about Indonesia in the first few months?
Indonesia was regarded as very important. I mean, there was, I think, a full awareness that as the largest Muslim state in the world, by far, and as the largest, in terms of population, state in Southeast Asia, we had a great interest in the success of Indonesia and its evolution in the direction of political stability and democracy. And so that was just I would say virtually a consensus starting point going in. It was not necessary to educate the political appointees who came in with President Bush about the importance of Indonesia. Paul Wolfowitz had been an ambassador there, as well as having been Assistant Secretary for the East Asian Pacific Bureau.
Right. So there was no need to educate the political appointees.
There's no need to. We did have sort of a personnel issue. Our ambassador there at the time had could have some rough edges.
That was Skip Boyce?
No, his predecessor, Bob Gelbard.
Okay.
And one of my tasks was to ease him out. His time had come to an end, but he didn't want to leave. And Skip Boyce was indeed his replacement. And Skip, of course, had not served in Indonesia before, but is just a thoroughly competent officer, a polyglot, picks up languages with alacrity and ease, and I think had a personality that was very much attuned to working in Javanese culture in particular.
So what was the idea for working with Indonesia? What were the concrete ideas?
Well, we wanted to work across the board, and our initial focus was on helping with democratic development and what we could do on that score. For example, we had put more than a few $1 million into helping the Indonesians construct a functioning, reputable, reliable, and well-regarded electoral system, mechanics of voting. And I think that was a critical factor at the nascent stages of Indonesian democracy. We also were concerned about human rights in Indonesia and about some episodes in the past where Indonesian Army personnel, particularly Special Forces personnel, had violated human rights in East Timor. And at that time, there was a legislation which most people associate with Senator Leahy, which very much circumscribed the kinds of activities with which we could engage the Indonesian military. And we were trying to address those concerns in the American Congress, both the House and the Senate, and to gain more latitude in how we interacted with the Indonesian military. We had concerns about improving the business climate in Indonesia because we felt that Indonesia's economic development could be accelerated significantly by greater foreign investment. That proved to be an area that was a bit disappointing. The Indonesians had a profoundly ambivalent attitude towards foreign investment, and it is not by far the easiest country in Southeast Asia for a foreign firm to find a hospitable climate. We had rule of law programs. We had various efforts to help with civil society. We tried to support freedom of the press. Of course, there was some skepticism in Indonesia regarding the United States, arising from things that had happened in the past, such as trying to overthrow the government. And you won't be surprised that Indonesian memories of those days are a lot sharper and in clearer focus than American memories. So that we had a lot to overcome in Indonesia.
So when you say that you were trying at that time to address some concerns about the military, do you mean that even before 9/11, that the administration wanted to restart the training program for the military officers? Is that what you were referring to?
Absolutely.
So even before 9/11, that was already on the cards.
Well, it certainly was, as far as I was concerned. And I don't remember getting any pushback from anybody else in the administration about it. And I had, publicly and on the record, had stated that denying Indonesians access, Indonesian military access to our programs for international military education and training was a mistake, and one that should be changed.
Mistake because?
It limited our access to senior Indonesian military decision makers, and by limiting our access, it made it more difficult for us to explain American policy and to explain why we thought it was in their interest that they take a different approach on certain issues. I think Foreign Service officers are congenitally predisposed to favor dialogue and to favor keeping open channels of communication. And basically the Leahy Amendment shut down a number of those channels of communication.
You also mentioned earlier, restarting dialogue about security with Thailand and Singapore. What would that have encompassed?
It encompasses two things primarily. First, it encompasses a operational environment where the armed forces of the two countries know how to interact with each other and can be mutually supportive. In part, that's a question of having common equipment, but more than common equipment, it's a question of having shared concepts about operations, about strategy, about tactics, and about very mundane but critical things, such as having access to spare parts. And one thing that could be very important is having, the technical term is a cross-servicing and acquisition agreement. So that if you're an F-15 pilot, an American F-15 pilot, and you land your plane in Singapore, and your ejection seat isn't working, you can swap it out in Singapore and get a new ejection seat that will work. And you already have the agreements to do that. You simply go down to the Singapore depot and say, hey guys, I need an ejection seat. Here's my IOU. And they in turn can do the same thing here. On the operational side, can you communicate with each other? Can you fight together? If an American bomber is making its way from Missouri nonstop to Afghanistan, can it be refueled in Singapore? How about, can Singapore refuel that bomber in the air? Those are not things that you can do in wartime for the first time very well. Those are things that you have to practice time and time again. And having that kind of security relationship pays invaluable dividends for the United States. Hurricane Katrina. From whence did the first air search and rescue helicopter squadron reach New Orleans? Singapore. They had a helicopter search and air rescue squadron in Texas, operating there. They have military based in the United States for a number of reasons. One of which is the mundane but very important reason that we have a lot of airspace and Singapore doesn't. And so there are many things that they can do here because of our wide open airspace that is available to them that would be very difficult for them to do given their geography, sort of pinned in between Indonesia, Malaysia, whatnot. And they immediately made those helicopters and their crews available to us. These are the sort of the unsung ways where a well-maintained alliance is really a valuable thing.
Was there an implicit sense that there may be a future threat coming from, say, China? Was that part of the unspoken assumption?
Yes. I mean, certainly it was not explicitly raised. We're worried about China by either side, but I think both sides knew that it was very, very difficult to try and predict with any confidence in what direction China would evolve. And I think that that the caution that was engendered by that conclusion has been certainly justified with the passage of time. But it wasn't just China. Remember that Lee Kuan Yew hung Indonesian commandos in the public square in Singapore after they attacked his country. There was periodic tensions with Malaysia. And the British had left the region. And so having the United States as a friendly partner, I think, commended itself to the Singaporeans. And of course, we are not treaty allies in the sense of NATO or even the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization alliance, which we still say remains in force and effect. But you don't necessarily have to have that kind of treaty alliance. As one of the points I made to the Singaporeans when we were updating our access agreement to their military facilities was that the NATO treaty does not say that the United States would come to the defense of Western Europe, including Greece and Turkey and so forth. It doesn't say we're going to fight for you. Our obligation and their obligation under the NATO treaty is to consult in accordance with our respective constitutional procedures about what to do next. That's it. I'm paraphrasing, but I'm fairly confident I'm doing justice to the substance of it. And I told the Singaporeans that, what gave meaning to that somewhat vague formulation was the reality that if the Soviets wanted to invade Germany, they were first going to have to overrun American units, and that those American units would not wait for orders from Washington to fight, because the way we had structured our deployments there, they would go to war at that point. They would fight. And once that happened, and I think it was Winston Churchill who said that what we have to do is to make sure that in the next war, the first soldier who gets killed is an American. That's what gave credibility to the NATO alliance. And the Singaporeans are very, very good and very quick. They understood the point immediately.
What would you say were the sort of core interests of the United States in Southeast Asia?
Historically, our core interests have been strategic. The Southeast Asia is first and foremost a maritime theater. And if you look at the percentage of crude oil that passes through the Southeast Asian choke points on its way to Japan, to Korea, to the Philippines, to China, even to Indonesia, it's quite striking. It's something over 3/4, I believe. Over half the world's trade passes through those choke points. So we have a profound economic interest in that strategic environment. And we have the other range of interests which are important. They're sometimes called soft interests as opposed to the hard-edged military security interests. And they cover the waterfront from democracy, human rights, combating trafficking in person, combating trafficking in narcotics, religious freedom, gay rights, the full panoply, women's rights. There's a lot of them out there. But the first in order of priority, I would say, were our strategic concerns. Economic concerns were second. And then we worked on all the others to one degree or another, under varying administrations with varying emphases.
And the incoming Bush administration at that time recognized all those same interests as well?
Oh, I think so. The hard debates for the incoming administration, was China. What do we do about China? What do we do with China? And they had not really sorted that out by the time of 9/11. But that was, in Asia, certainly, I think, the primary focus of policy debate. In most of the other areas, there wasn't a lot of debate about ideally what we should be doing. There would be questions about, will the Congress let us do this in Indonesia? What about Vietnam? How much resistance will we get if we want to do X, Y, and Z? How do we deal with Hun Sen in Cambodia? Laos. it Laos, I would describe as a geriatric communist hermit kingdom, you know, which was thoroughly enthralled to Vietnam, and I don't think there realistically was a lot we could do to change that in the short term, and we didn't have a lot of interests that would leverage change, either in Washington or out there. So it was almost a set aside. Brunei, sort of the same story. You know, a population perhaps the size of Washington, D.C., a lot of oil money. It had been held at arm's length for some time because the Sultan of Brunei had, I think, if I remember correctly, provided some of the funding that was Ali North handled back in the Reagan administration, bypassing congressional strictures on assistance going to Central America. But in any event, Brunei is not a major issue.
How had Southeast Asian governments reacted to the Bush administration calling China the United States strategic competitor? Because that was the term that was used.
Well, I don't think they were too upset by that. What they were about the terminology per se, they were concerned that they not get caught in between a major conflict between the United States and China. They very much wanted to see the United States and China work things out, have a harmonious relationship. I didn't get the sense, or let me rephrase, I don't remember either a government official or non-governmental people, scholars, journalists, and so forth, with whom I would talk about broad issues in Southeast Asia, ever express concern about the phrase strategic competitor. That was sufficiently ambiguous that it could cover, and they wanted to see what it meant in practice, you know, and they were willing to go along with sort of any overall chapeau, overarching terminology. They wanted to see the more concrete perspective.
So 9/11 happened. What was sort of the first reaction that you had when 9/11 happened, just in terms of thinking about what difference it might make to your job at that time?
Well, actually, I learned about it while I was sitting in a classified briefing room with Jim Kelly and some of the other EAP front office personnel, and we saw the second plane hit a World Trade Tower, and immediately concluded that it wasn't an attack on the United States. And I think my reaction was, well, the rules of the game have just changed. And in fact, going to war and prosecuting that war effectively became our highest priority. And to that end, we wanted to mobilize as many countries in support of what we were doing as we possibly could. I'd earlier referred to Australia. As it happened, John Howard was visiting the United States, and from his suite in the Willard Hotel, he could see the smoke rising from the Pentagon when the first plane went into there. And John Howard immediately returned to Australia. We had to provide a plane because we'd closed down American airspace. And while he was in flight, summoned his cabinet and told them, basically, meet me at Planeside because we're going to war. And shortly thereafter, I was given a draft declaration of war, which was so robust that our European allies, who had not yet evolved a position on what to do, were concerned, because I think it made them look sort of pusillanimous and vacillating in comparison, which was not an entirely unwarranted concern on their part. But I think Australia was the first country to invoke a bilateral security treaty with the United States and declare war in response to an attack upon the United States. Reactions in other countries varied. Indonesia, and Megawati Sukarno-Putri in particular, was torn by this and wanted to keep a certain distance from the United States, and was reluctant to engage in a dialogue with us. That was not an easy time or an easy process. I was struck by the amount of attention which publics throughout the region, including Indonesia, paid to events and how they unfolded. The publics were, through the electronic media principally, were much more attuned to what was going on and what it meant for them than I would have projected, would have expected. And one can go back and look at the reputable public opinion operations during that period of time, Social Weather Station in the Philippines, the Pew Research Center, and chart some very distinct shifts in public opinion that followed quite hard upon events. For example, despite there were very great reservations among the Indian populace about our decision to go into Afghanistan. But after the Taliban regime fell and they saw the televised images of people celebrating in the streets and dancing and rejoicing at the fall of the Taliban, public opinion in Indonesia regarding the United States went up rather markedly. Other countries were very supportive. Vietnam and Cambodia really did not, in our conception, have much of a role to play in this, but we did express concern that they might keep a close eye on their own indigenous Muslim populations till things got sorted out. Of course, they were doing that already, but I think they increased their efforts a little bit. Burma understood our concerns about the potential for Muslim terrorism because they had a certain problem of their own. And with the initial exception of Indonesia, all the countries were quite responsive to our requests for increased security around American diplomatic facilities, whether that be a consulate, an embassy, a USIS library, or so forth. And other countries went further. Thailand, Australia, New Zealand, Philippines sent troops to Afghanistan. Other countries would send medical teams. Other countries would help with government capacity building when the fighting was over, development programs, and so forth. We did not specifically ask anything of the Burmese, aside from increased protection for the embassy. And what had been our consulate in the north, which was still used as a recreation house, although we didn't officially have a consulate there at that point. We had a misconception at the outset. At the outset of 9/11, we were concerned at the potential migration of Al-Qaeda terrorists and affiliated groups from Afghanistan through Pakistan, where they had relatively easy transit, to Malaysia, where there was a very relaxed visa regime and immigration system for people who came from predominantly Muslim countries or had a passport from a Muslim country, to Indonesia, to the Philippines, and to a lesser extent to Singapore. There were probably only a few individuals that actually made that trek. What we didn't realize was that they were already there. There were a lot of veterans of the jihad against the Soviet Union and Afghanistan who, upon returning home, joined organizations that had, let's call it an extremist Islamic ideology, but which did not at the time pursue violent activities. They pursued charitable activities, educational activities, social activities, nothing that one would regard as objectionable or exceptional necessarily. But virtually overnight, a number of these organizations, Jemaah Islamiyah in particular, became operational in a terrorist or insurgent sense. And this created a lot of problems. And it was very much a transnational phenomena. Many of the Indonesians who became part of this movement actually received their spiritual guidance and in some cases education in Malaysia. And others received training in the Philippines. And so it was not purely a country-by-country kind of problem. It was a regional problem, although how to deal with it assumed more or less a country-by-country approach. Overall, we had a strategy triad, if you will. Because the governments of the region were not hostile to us, and in some cases very well disposed towards us, it was not a region where we judged that military approaches would be advisable. And so we focused on intelligence cooperation, on law enforcement, and on strengthening judicial processes and procedures to go after terrorists, basically treating them as a cross between insurgents and criminals. And only in the Philippines did we actually deploy a military force of some size, the Joint Special Operations Task Force, JSOTA-P, in Mindanao. And I think at the height of their operations, which were aimed at the Abu Sayyaf group in support of the armed forces of the Philippines, we may have had close to 1,000 people there. But their role was not to go out and hunt down the Abu Sayyaf group themselves. Their role was to help the AFP. And they were pretty careful to stay within those strictures. Indonesia was complicated because, as I mentioned, the Leahy Amendment precluded us from doing a lot of the things we would have otherwise have done with the Indonesian military. And so we had the idea of creating an Indonesian police counterterrorist team. At that point, the Indonesian police had recently separated from the Indonesian military and had become a civilian organization. And their expertise fell more into traffic enforcement, perhaps, and that kind of area than counterterrorism. President Yudhoyono, having been an Indonesian military officer himself, had a different perspective on these things than his predecessor, President Megawati Soekarno-Putri. And he was very quick to accept our offer, and the only kind of condition we articulated was that the individuals who were assigned to this unit had to have squeaky clean human rights records. They had to be carefully vetted and re-vetted as time went on, because we just could not run the risk of having a human rights outrage that would have sabotaged the program. So we supplied them, we trained them, we equipped them. The Australians were very, very helpful on the intelligence side, and that unit, which became known as Task Force 88, proved itself to be very effective, and over the years has captured a fair number of people who subsequently made their way to court where they were tried and convicted, the Bali bombers, for example. Some others weren't taken alive. It goes like that. But they've proven themselves to be a real success story. And actually their name is a derivative of our program. we funded the program through anti-terrorism assistance monies, or ATA. And ATA is a difficult phrase for Bahasa speakers to articulate. It became easier to call it, instead of Task Force ATA, Task Force 88. So that was the derivation of the name. But that was a direct response to what we were doing with the Indonesians. We also had broader concerns about Indonesia. It simply wasn't a tactical concern that we hunt down or that the Indonesians hunt down and kill terrorists or put them in prison for long periods of time. We had a very creative approach. Karen Brooks, incidentally, I think gets a lot of credit for it, to fund improving the secular curriculum of pesantren's or religious schools in Indonesia, so that when people left those schools, they would have a secular skill set, including hopefully some job skills that would go well beyond the ability to recite passages from the Quran in Arabic. And I thought that was a very creative response to a very real need, and interestingly, one of which, had we tried to do it in the United States, would probably have been deemed unconstitutional for breaching the separation of church and state, but we got away with it in Indonesia. Thailand was very helpful, as we had a long security and intelligence relationship with the Thai. It paid off. We had, by that point, I think we'd repaired some of the damage that had been done during the Thai financial crisis, when the Clinton administration simply refused to help. The administration even refused to send a representative to the first multilateral meeting held in Tokyo to discuss the problem, to see what could be done, let alone pledging money. Just didn't show up, which was a real blow to our relationship with the Thai. They couldn't understand it. They had sort of looked at us, figuratively speaking, as their big brother for many, many decades, and were just flabbergasted at the attitude we adopted. But they were, again, I can't talk about specifically what happened on the intelligence side, but the Thai were very cooperative and very helpful. And they were helpful on the military side as well. You may know that we had access to a major Thai naval air base at Utapao, which has perhaps the longest runway in Southeast Asia. And so if you wanted to bring in a heavily laden plane that needed a lot of room to be able to execute a landing and refill, have a place for the crew to take some rest, to sleep, refuel the plane, and get it back on its way with no muss and fuss, the Thai were helpful. The Indonesians were helpful. On the intelligence side, on the law enforcement side, they were helpful in facilitating overflight of our aircraft. The Singaporeans were superb. It was a joy to work with them. Let's see if I left anybody out of the mix.
I think you mentioned the Philippines already.
Well, I mentioned the Philippines in context of the forces we deployed there. And they too sent units to Afghanistan and later to Iraq. But the Philippines has a major vulnerability. Something on the order of 10% of their GDP comes from workers' remittances. And the status, the treatment, the standing of overseas Philippine workers is an important, it's a visceral political issue in the Philippines. And when in Iraq, some of the Philippine nationals who were working as contractors were taken prisoner, the government immediately said, well, we'll withdraw our Philippine troops. And that was kind of disappointing. But they simply couldn't bear to see their personnel being held. whereas the United States in those days, would not negotiate for the release of hostages or prisoners. Or we would not make concessions, let me put it that way, for the release of hostages or prisoners. If one means by talking negotiations, then yeah, we would talk, but we would not make substantive concessions.
So if I may step back a little bit, so you say it took a while to realize that the terrorists were already there, as opposed to trying to make their way to Southeast Asia. How long did it take the U.S. to realize that?
Well, when the first bombs went off, for example, in Jakarta, a not well-trained group of terrorists had an accident in their car. They were playing with the hand grenades and pulled the pin out of one and oops, dropped it, and it went off in the car. But in the car was a map showing directions to the American ambassador's residence. The Indonesian's Megawati was still in office and didn't want to acknowledge this as a terrorist event necessarily. She was really conflicted about that. But with things like the Bali bombings, we collected in Afghanistan information that indicated an impending terrorist attack in Singapore, and the people were long-term residents of Singapore. They were not recent transplants from Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And so, reality set in fairly quickly, and we never did see the indications of movement of large numbers of people. It didn't happen. As I say, a few may have fallen into that, or did fall into that camp, but not large numbers.
Was it the understanding, as far as the U.S. was concerned, that these were Al-Qaeda cells, or was there the understanding that they were different, even if they were also terrorist and extremist in nature?
No, we saw them as different. They were veterans in many cases of the jihad against the Soviet Union.
Right.
And there were a few Al-Qaeda members that indeed we picked up in Southeast Asia. But these were different. These Jamaat Islamiyah, I do not think could fairly be construed as an Al-Qaeda cell. Nor could the Abu Sayyaf group, although there was a connection at the beginning. One of the initial founders of the Abu Sayyaf group had connections in Manila with one of Osama bin Laden's brothers-in-law, if I remember the relationship correctly. But none of us regarded the Abu Sayyaf group as being an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. Actually, I tended to regard it more as a criminal enterprise that had a fairly thin veneer of Islamic ideology superimposed on top, but basically these were criminals who engaged in extortion and kidnapping and bank robbery and that sort of thing.
If I recall correctly, though, there was a sense at that time that, at least as transmitted through the media, I think President Bush himself had called Southeast Asia the second front in the war against terror. So there was a sense, at least in public, that the U.S. was approaching terrorism with a broad sweep.
Well, remember, the Bush administration did adopt the phrase global war on terrorism, which was an unfortunate phrase to have adopted, because I think, one, it was not accurate. We were not going after terrorists everywhere. We were focusing our efforts on terrorists who were targeting Americans. For example, we didn't do much about terrorists in Kashmir. But nonetheless, the expression global war on terrorism, which was implemented as in the form of active operations in Afghanistan and then Iraq, lent itself to a belief in parts of the world of Islam that this meant a war on Islam as opposed to a war on terror. And so that was an unfortunate terminology from my perspective. And I think you may have indeed have been right about viewing Southeast Asia as a second front. And there was some reason for that, in the sense that I have one friend who was wounded in 2 different hotel bombings in Jakarta. Just bad luck. He happened to be on hand for both of them. He's since left Indonesia. His wife said, "Okay, enough is enough. We're not going to stick this one out." He was in the civilians. He was a businessman, not a government official. So you did have those events. You did have plots, active plots in Malaysia and in Singapore. You did have activities in the Philippines. And I did not regard it as terrorism, but there was an American couple that was taken by the Abu Sayyaf group in the Philippines, the Burnhams. And in one of the relatively few differences I had with where the administration came out, the Department of Defense did not view with favor the idea of planning for a rescue attempt by our Special Forces personnel who were there, who had all the equipment, who had the special ops helicopters, who had the intelligence backup and everything else. They wouldn't, Department of Defense wouldn't countenance it. Nor would they countenance using our special ops helicopters to insert a trained Filipino unit. Now, the Filipino unit was not as well trained as the American Special Forces guys were, but they were better than the locally available units. And instead, one of the locally available units went in, and Mr. Burnham was killed by friendly fire. So that was a bitter pill from my perspective. I should say that in most instances, on policy certainly in Southeast Asia, we in the State Department, and this was an unusual period, found ourselves more closely aligned with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Uniformed Services than we did the civilian leadership of the Pentagon. And that was not normally the case. If one looks back over the decades, usually you would find the State Department and the Office of the Secretary tended to be more in alignment on their policy outlooks. But while I was there, it was an unusual period, put it that way.
Well, could you explain why?
Well, a lot had to do with the perspectives of not so much Paul Wolfowitz, but Secretary Rumsfeld and a lot of the other people that he brought in. And they could would advocate approaches that we did not deem advisable. For example, Secretary Rumsfeld got authority to use special operations personnel in foreign countries without informing the American ambassador, let alone the State Department. And some very ill-conceived proposals were surfaced under that rubric. And not only did the State Department find itself bypassed, the ISA, International Security Affairs Office, the civilian side, the Pentagon's foreign policy shop, was also bypassed, as a number of these things were brought up for consideration and launched. And so, yes, there was a sense for a period that Southeast Asia was the second front in the war on terrorism, and some things were, again, surfaced that happily did not get to fruition because they would have been disasters, at least from my perspective. And I think from the perspective of a number of people, of others in the State Department, as well as some of our uniformed colleagues.
Can you be more specific? Can you give examples?
No, it would break too much crockery.
Were there ways in which it did matter, that it did, where it did actually affect what happened out there?
Happily, with one exception, we were able to sidetrack these proposals before personnel were actually inserted. And in the one case where they were inserted, we were able to have them removed before things blew up on us. And that's about as far as I'd like to go on that.
Sure. I can't help but think of the
Someday
report.
it'll be declassified. And what were they thinking about? You know?
I mean, I can't help but think about the Senate report on torture that came out in the end of last year, 2014, in which Thailand was mentioned as actually, I think that was the first country, I think, that had black site. Was it one of those things that?
No, I was referring specifically to military operations, and not to an intelligence operation.
I see. Well, since we're on the topic of the black site, was that something that the State Department had any inkling of at all?
Yes. And that's all I'm going to say about it.
Could you maybe suggest why it might have been Thailand? Why Thailand?
Thailand over the years has, when the United States has faced real problems on issues big and small, Thailand has stood with us, even in circumstances where important Thai interests could be jeopardized. Let me give you an example from the 1990s. Nothing to do with terrorism, but actually having to do with narcotics. A narcotics trafficker whom we very much wanted surfaced in KL. And at that point, we did not have agreements with the Malaysians regarding extradition of this kind of individual to American custody. But the Malaysians did say, well, you know, he's in court, he's out of status, you know, immigration status is not proper. He's going to have to leave. And you know, if you watch carefully, you'll know when and where he's going. They made sure we watched carefully and knew when and where he's going, and he ended up being deported to Thailand. And we had enough notice of that to tell the Thai, well, we would really like to have him. And the Thai government said, well, in all likelihood, he's going to arrive here with improper documentation, given the circumstances of this whole matter. And we will not allow him to stay. We'll put him on the next departing aircraft. And so we had an aircraft sitting there at the next gate at the airport. And indeed, that plane from KL landed. Thai custom officials went on board, went to the skull and said, you know, passport and visa, please. Didn't have it. They lifted him up. They physically carried him off the plane. His feet never touched Thai soil. And he got a free trip to the United States. Now that is what I call practical cooperation. And that means a whole lot more than written agreements. Comparisons are invidious, but I'm going to do it. We had in the Philippines over the years a status of forces agreement. And over the years, we had all kinds of problems on how to handle American personnel who were accused of misdeeds. And in some cases, there were reasons for the accusation. In other cases, there was perhaps not an empirical foundation for the accusation, but nonetheless, nationalism could assert itself and become very problematic, both for us and for the government in Manila. In Thailand over the years, we also had a lot of American servicemen. We had no status of forces agreement. None. None whatsoever. And from time to time, our young lions in Thailand would get into trouble. And we were always able to work those problems out in a mutually satisfactory fashion. Now that certainly does not mean that the American in question avoided the consequences of his or her conduct. I know the case of one American serviceman who was trying to smuggle large quantities of heroin back to the United States in his household goods, and the Thai caught him, tried him, and put him in a Thai prison. That was fine with us. He had legal representation. He was indeed guilty. In other circumstances, people would have too much to drink, there would be an accident, whatever. We're able to sort that out. And whether it involved the Thai judicial system or whether it involved quiet discussions between the embassy officers or a local governor, things got worked out in a way that was satisfactory. So having a written document of which American lawyers are so fond is not necessarily the litmus test of having a good working relationship. And over the decades, the Thai have been superb partners for the United States.
Now, you said earlier that when 9/11 happened, these various countries in Southeast Asia were very helpful in their counterterrorism efforts.
Yes.
Did that change over time?
I think it's fair to say that the invocation of a relationship between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda and the erroneous specter of a nuclear-armed Iraq damaged our credibility in the region. It damaged our credibility with the people in the region, populace. And to the extent that one has governments that take into account public opinion, when public opinion shifts against you, it makes it more difficult for those governments to be helpful. I would say that on the counterterrorist side, certainly through the period that I served, governments remained helpful. Obviously, their capabilities varied, one from the other, but without exception, they remained helpful.
Did it require more effort on your part, especially after the invasion of Iraq took place, to to ensure that these governments remain helpful?
Yes, it did. It required more urging, more consultations. But to the best of my knowledge, as I say, we remained successful. Nobody pulled the plug and said, well, we're going to stop sharing information with you, or there's this person you're concerned about, we're going to let them loose. I mean, there was not a turning of backs, let me put it that way. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, you know, Singapore, for example, I thought had a very sophisticated approach to handling the people that they had arrested. They made sure that their families received rent subsidies, received welfare payments. You know, they were not evicted from their housing. Their kids were able to go to school. They got a group of Muslim religious leaders together and said, hey, look, you need to start talking to these people about how what they are doing is not in keeping with the tenets of Islam. I was very impressed by it. Now, you know, nobody's perfect. Singapore had a very embarrassing circumstance where one of these guys escaped from the bathroom through a ventilation shaft and so forth. And, you know, he's picked up later. But, you know, we had a lot of very competent partners in all of this. And, you know, that is, Americans should see as a source of gratification, and it's part of what one can hope for when one maintains good relationships across the board. You just can't go in suddenly when there's a problem and ask for help. You have to maintain the relationships when you don't have a problem. You know, you have to sit down and talk to people and eat and drink with them when you're not asking for something. So that when you do have an urgent situation arise, you can pick up the phone and your call will be taken, and you'll have a sympathetic hearing. Right. But that, I'm pontificating, I'm sorry, I don't mean to do that.
Was it surprising to you? Did these governments out there, you know, before the U.S. turned its attention to terrorism, did these governments out there know about these homegrown extremists? Did they have intelligence on it?
No, I think in many cases they were taken aback, as were we. I think the Singaporeans were taken aback, the Malaysians were taken aback, the Indonesians. I mean, the Philippines did have, first they had a communist insurgency, and they had a separatist movement in Mindanao. First, the Moro, or the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, the MILF. They had the Abu Sayyaf group, and so they had an awareness that they had a problem, and there was some very quiet cooperation between Malaysia and the United States that was aimed at convincing the MILF that they should not allow territory that they controlled to be used for training of Jamaat Islamiyah terrorists and perhaps others. And so that was, you know, an example of political cooperation aimed at dealing with the terrorist problem. And it was, you know, it was in the interest of both Malaysia and the United States and the Philippines that not take place. And we also tried to help the government of Manila reach an accommodation with the MILF, but we were careful to do it by using a cutout, the U.S. Institute of Peace. In other words, it would not have helped the situation to have an official American mediation effort, given our history in the Philippines. Remember, Captain John Pershing served fighting the Moros. in the early part of the 19th century, or the 20th century. We had a history there. But what we wanted to do was to convince them that if they could work things out with the government in Manila, that we would underwrite the peace, we would fund job training programs, we would fund economic development efforts, and in fact, while I was serving, I would say that over half of our development assistance budget for the Philippines was spent in Mindanao. We made a major effort in that regard.
So the Philippine government took up the offer?
Well, they had their own we didn't give them an offer to take up. I mean, they welcomed our spending the money wherever we were going to spend it. I think they might have preferred that we spend more of it outside of Mindanao, but and they agreed to USIP, not sitting at the bargaining table, but talking to one side, talking to the other, offering ideas, trying to find creative solutions. And there were other groups involved in that. For example, the Henri Dunant Center out of Switzerland, and they had some extremely capable people working in Southeast Asia. In Indonesia, one of the non-governmental people was a most impressive woman by the name of Sidney Jones. And if one ever wanted to know what was happening inside of the various Muslim activist groups, let me call them that, inside of Indonesia, Sidney was certainly the person to talk to. Right. So there were a lot of contacts that we pursued outside of official governmental circles, and I referred to the triad of intelligence, law enforcement, and judicial procedures. The other thing from a strategic perspective, we tried to be careful not to get out front publicly on any of this. We tried to be very careful to remain in the background, not clandestinely, not covertly, but simply in a way that respected the standing and the authorities and responsibilities of the governments of the region.
Did you ever get the sense, at least in the Philippines, that they were in some ways taking advantage of the situation, taking advantage of U.S. interest in terrorism to really fight a slightly different war, which is the war against moral independence?
We were very careful not to let that happen. Our personnel had very clear guidelines that they were not to go after the MILF. They were to stay out of MILF territory. And when I met in KL with leadership of the MILF, I explicitly pointed out to them that we had not put them on the U.S. terrorist list. And that we noted the fact that they had not targeted Americans. They had killed one, but he was not targeted. He was a Filipino-American who just happened to be in the wrong place when a bomb went off. It was absolutely not an effort to target an American. And so there were people in the government of the Philippines who perhaps would have wanted to see us become engaged on that front. But as a matter of policy, we were very careful not to go down that path.
What about in Thailand? Was there any effort also to take advantage of U.S. interest in terrorism in their own struggle with Muslim separatists?
Well, I think it would be fair to say that if we had something to offer, information, better communications equipment, training, the Thai certainly would have been receptive. But the Thai did not want American personnel getting involved in that particular activity, nor did the Malaysians. And so as a practical matter, I don't recall that ever coming up.
In Aceh, in Indonesia, Was that ever an issue?
Yes. And there had been links between the GAM and other groups in the region, to include some of the Muslim insurgent groups in Burma and Myanmar, and some indications of connections with terrorist groups in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And basically, we met with the GAM and had a, not in Indonesia, but met with them and explained to them that we supported the state of Indonesia and did not support separatist movements, and that any thought they had of changing that policy would be unavailing or unproductive. Now, of course, after the tsunami, situation in Aceh changed radically. So that had a positive outcome. In part due to the tsunami. There were actually sermons in Aceh that one of the reasons the tsunami hit was that, you know, people had done things that they shouldn't have, and this was a form of punishment. But I'm hard-pressed to think of another insurgency that changed direction so quickly. And certainly UDONA, I think, gets credit for skillful handling of an opportunity.
And when did that meeting take place with the GAM leaders outside Indonesia?
2003, if I remember correctly, in Stockholm.
Okay. And was that with a view to resolving this long-standing dispute, or was there part of
No, it wasn't with a view to resolving it. It was with a view towards making clear what the attitude of the United States would be towards their insurgent endeavor.
Okay.
And also making clear that the government of Indonesia understood that our concerns regarding human rights and the conduct of their armed forces were not a disguised way of trying to support this separatist movement.
As far as you can tell, were there any unintended consequences in terms of what the U.S. was trying to achieve in Southeast Asia?
Just in the nature of things, there probably were, but I'm hard-pressed to give you a concrete example, which means there probably were and we didn't know about it, or we didn't make the connections between.
Right. At least during your time, were there rumblings from Southeast Asian governments about counterterrorism taking up too much bandwidth?
No, there were grumblings in a number of areas, but not specifically on that. We did, for example, one human rights group was shortly after 9/11 came in and to express their dismay that the Malaysian government was using the Official Secrets Act to detain people without trial and so forth. And they wanted us to tell the Malaysians they had to stop doing that, basically. And I said, well, gee, some of the people that are being detained under the authority of the Official Secrets Act are known terrorists. And somehow I don't think we're going to make the kinds of representations that you're advocating. You know, so there were places where our pursuit of the counter-terrorist environment took some energy or some would say bandwidth, some of the policy energy, some of the priorities, some of the time. Not too much in the way of funding, actually. We pretty much kept up our funding for civil society, for democracy promotion, for efforts to address trafficking of people, trafficking of narcotics. Those programs continued. Actually, I think we were probably too slow to cut back on our counter-narcotics efforts. They went along well past the point that narcotics coming from Southeast Asia presented a problem in the United States. But that was nothing to do with the counterterrorism effort. That was bureaucratic inertia.
Some people have said that because the U.S. was so focused, so singularly focused on counterterrorism, that China was able to sort of then step up and fill in some of the vacuum. What would you say to that?
I don't think that's the case. On the military side, the Pacific is first and foremost a naval theater of operations, a maritime theater of operations. And the Navy, although it played a certain role in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and at some points was stressed, particularly on the logistical side, in support of operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. The Navy never left the Pacific. They kept up a very vigorous tempo of operations there. And you could see that in response to the assistance we brought into Aceh after the tsunami and to other parts of the region. Our economic activities, our trade promotion, trade facilitation, commercial representation, all of that continued. Our activities in support of democracy and human rights all continued. Now, if you ask me, did China expand its influence during that period of time? Clearly they did. I thought that the quality of Chinese diplomatic representation improved significantly in the 1990s and the first part of this century. The amount of money and effort China devoted to expanding its relationships and improving the quality of those relationships was very, very significant. There was a growing awareness in the region of China's potential as a market for products, particularly natural resources. And so all of these things, I believe, contributed to a different appreciation on the part of the countries of the region of the importance of China in the region's future and their future. But these were independent of our counter-terrorist efforts. And so I would be very slow. I would have to be convinced that the counter-terrorist effort, by distracting our attention, somehow opened the door to China. I think China's rise has been inevitable. It's something that we would like to shape, should try to shape, but it's not something that's going to be stopped. I'm not going to say I would necessarily welcome it. I'd perhaps like to see it take place at a slower pace so that China gets itself on a better footing internally. And I think there's a lot of tensions and strains building within China that could spill over into the international sphere, and that worries me. Mm-hmm. But I don't necessarily think that our counter-terrorist efforts, although certainly they took a lot of time and energy and attention, they didn't blind our eyes to what was happening elsewhere. Nor did they take a great deal of the energy that we were expending, either political energy or development assistance funding or this, that, and the other thing in the region. It was not a void.
Right. Now, you did say earlier, though, that the war in Iraq did undermine U.S. credibility.
Yes, I believe it did.
Do you think that that had long-term effects, or was it something that the U.S. has been able to recover from?
I think that in a future circumstance, if we were to present to a government the case for going to war, it may take more convincing and persuasion than it would have been before, that would have been required before Iraq. There will be more skepticism, more of a show-me attitude. I want to see the raw intelligence. We made some very serious errors. And I have to believe that Secretary Powell wishes he had another bite at that apple. But yeah, we're going to live with the consequences of those errors, both in the initial decision to go to war and then in how we handled Iraq after we toppled Saddam Hussein. That was not a very pretty picture to watch.
Now, you were still in office when the scandal in Abu Ghraib broke out. Did that impact relations with Southeast Asia? Did the Southeast Asian governments have any reaction to that?
Well, I think they were, throughout the world of Islam, there was a sense of dismay at what happened at Abu Ghraib. It may indeed have had an impact if we had approached another government saying, look, we'd like to have a holding facility here for some of the terrorists we picked up. I would imagine that post-Abu Ghraib, there would have been a whole lot less receptivity to doing something like that for us than there would have been prior to Abu Ghraib. Now, we didn't have to my knowledge, we didn't have that circumstance arise in Southeast Asia. But it doesn't take a lot of imagination to imagine how that would have affected the calculations of a foreign government.
Did any of their diplomats come to you expressing outrage, demanding an explanation?
No. Now, there were a couple of occasions, not officially, there were a couple of occasions when I'd be out eating and drinking, when a foreign diplomat I'd known for, say, 20 years, would look at me and said, Matt, what the, F were you guys doing? And express not so much outrage, because comparatively speaking, although what happened at Abu Ghraib was degrading, demeaning, could be considered a form of torture, compared to what they'd seen happen elsewhere, it wasn't the worst thing they had seen. I mean, this was not breaking new records. That we would be so dumb, there was dismay, more at how could we have let something like this happen, than the actual quality of the acts, which we all found lamentable.
Did you ever get a sense from the governments that because of U.S. actions in Abu Ghraib, and then later the existence of Guantanamo Bay, which continues to be controversial in some parts of the world, do you feel like those things sort of gave cover to some of the governments, especially those that have official secrets acts or internal security acts, to continue to do things that perhaps the United States would rather they not do?
That might be the case, although I think that the usage of the Official Secrets Acts are today far fewer than they were in the old days. I don't think from a human rights perspective that that's as big of a problem as it used to be, whether we're talking about Malaysia or Singapore or Myanmar, for that matter. But certainly if one wanted to turn aside an American diplomat who came to express concern or deliver a protest about something that had happened along those lines, if I were working for a foreign ministry, I'd reach into my desk drawer and say, now, you mean like Abu Ghraib, and pull out some 8x10 glossies? Yeah. When we do things that are not in keeping with our ideals, even if they were not done as a matter of policy, even if they were not countenanced by senior officials, which if I recall correctly was the case in Abu Ghraib, nonetheless, when those things happen, they make advancing American interests more difficult. And yeah, that is a reality.
Do you get a sense that, I know you said that as far as the U.S. is concerned, we continue to push for democratic reform and support democracy building. But do you have a sense that either because of the war on terrorism or because the U.S. went about it in such a blunt manner in Iraq, in talking about democracy building and so on, that it did undercut efforts in Southeast Asia to push for democratic change?
No, not really. If you look at this period, you've seen improvements in democracy in Indonesia. At this, during the period we're talking about, the period that I was with the administration, Thailand was progressing on a democratic course. The Philippines remained a vibrant, raucous democracy, flawed and imperfect, but so is ours. Singapore continued to develop and evolve, and I count them as a democracy, even though they have a culture which is not quite the same as democracies in the United States or, say, Great Britain. But nonetheless, politics is a hardball sport in Singapore. Reminds me of Chicago. But they do have rule of law, and there certainly was no backsliding in Singapore while we were off doing other things. There was no positive progress to report in Laos, but then I don't think there would have been anyway, given the nature of the country and the regime. Vietnam opened up a little bit. Certainly they haven't become a democracy, but there's a little bit more space for expression. Certainly there's more space for individual initiative outside of the political sphere. They've got a long way to go, but again, I realistically don't think that is anything we could have advanced had we not been engaged in counter-terrorist efforts and had we not been engaged in Iraq, I don't think they would have been susceptible to our blandishments, nor to have any reason to think that had we been doing things elsewhere or doing things differently, that they would have allowed that to impact their internal political dynamic. The one area in Southeast Asia where our policy failed, but it had nothing to do with the war on terrorism, was in Burma. That was the one part of our policy that I cannot point to with any sense of pride. Now, to be fair to the administration, Burma policy had, a decade or more before, had been ceded to the Congress and to advocacy groups. The executive branch stopped controlling Burma policy long before the Bush 43 administration came into office. But nonetheless, it was not a success story from my perspective. Not that there was any disagreement on the goals and objectives of policy, there wasn't. But rather it was what kind of strategy did we use to try and advance their goals and objectives. And to summarize our strategy, it was to isolate and sanction Burma and to try and cut them off from the rest of the world. And there were two major problems with that approach. The first was that the Burmese themselves, when they felt under international pressure, foreign pressure, going back for centuries, would try to isolate the country from the rest of the world, and so reinforced their strategy. The second problem with it on the sanction side is that absent the participation and the agreement of all the key players, sanctions have failed across the board as an instrument of policy, of bringing another country to our will. And we did not have the support of all the key players. Nowhere near it. We had the support of a number of players who weren't key players, for example, the European Union. But we didn't have China. We didn't have much of Southeast Asia. And we were unwilling to do what was necessary to elevate Burma on the priority list high enough to get others on board. Even if, and it's not clear to me that we would have been successful, even if we had done that. For example, when the American president would meet with the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, they'd talk about Taiwan, talk about arms sales, talk about the renminbi, talk about Taiwan, talk about exchange rates, talk about trade deficits. Burma didn't figure into those conversations. It was never a high priority. And so Burma policy was left again to the Congress, which stunningly delegated it to Aung San Suu Kyi. If you go back through the congressional record and legislative history and do a word count, I think, and I don't suggest you do it, but you might get a graduate student who's looking for a dissertation topic to this. I suspect you'll find more references to Aung San Suu Kyi than to any other foreign leader. And you'll find more provisions saying, well, you can do this if the National League of Democracy approves it or if Aung San Suu Kyi approves it. We really delegated policy formulation to her. And I think that set back a positive evolution in the internal politics of Burma for a while. And because we had so little contact with the Burmese regime at the time, we did not understand what they were thinking and doing, and they did not understand what we were thinking and doing. There was quite a mismatch there. There's very little high-level contact, very few serious conversations about whatever.
As you mentioned, some Southeast Asian governments were pushing for engagement.
And they were right.
But the United States didn't take that view?
Oh, no. As I say, our policy was one of isolation and sanction.
Right.
And we tried to press them to join us in that. And by and large, they refused.
So the U.S. didn't take their view, give their view much credence? I mean, they were, after all, the immediate neighbors. And they had accepted Myanmar into ASEAN, too.
Correct. Well, no, our Burma policy or Myanmar policy, again, was not shaped by the executive branch. The executive branch, and this is not a partisan issue, let me underline. Their Burma policy was a bipartisan policy for this period of time. But it was outsourced. It was outsourced domestically to advocacy groups and to the Congress, outsourced internationally to Aung San Suu Kyi. At one point, the Indian government, and this is the mid-1990s, which at that time had a Burma policy that was very similar to ours. Remember that Aung San Suu Kyi was an Indian convent girl, literally. And there was enormous sympathy in India, a democracy, for the democratic movement in Burma. But at one point, and at that time, even the sympathy was so strong that the Indian Defense Minister, George Fernandez, had Burmese refugees living in his compound, in his house. Quite extraordinary. But nonetheless, the Indians became concerned about what they saw as China gaining a foothold in Burma and on the Andaman Sea, which would adversely impact their security interests. And they wanted to have consultations with us about China and what we should do about China. Washington wasn't interested. Just said, no, there's nothing to worry about as far as China's concerned. The Indians were okay. Shortly after that, India changed its policy towards Burma and tried to improve their relations, cooperated with them on tracking insurgent groups on both sides of their border, bidding on potential gas leases in the Andaman Sea and Burmese waters and so forth and so on. But no, we pretty much turned a deaf ear to the representations of other governments.
It's interesting you should say that Burma just wasn't high up enough on the list of priorities. Some of the things I've heard in other interviews even suggest that Southeast Asia as a whole, aside from the war on terror, just is not all that high up in the list of priorities for the U.S. Did you ever feel that when you were in office?
No, I didn't. And I think in part I have to attribute this to the unusual personnel staffing of the Bush 43 administration as far as Southeast Asia was concerned. Look, my chain of command went from, I reported to Jim Kelly, a career naval officer before he retired from the Navy, who had spent his career, he was a Pacific sailor. He knew Southeast Asia very well. He knew the Pacific very well. He knew Japan well and Korea. So I reported to Jim. If Jim wasn't around, I reported to Rich Armitage, a Naval Academy graduate, 3 or 4 tours in Vietnam, visited Thailand several times in the 1980s when I was there on my first tour in Thailand. If Jim Kelly wasn't around and Rich Armitage wasn't around, it was Colin Powell. Again, someone who spent a lot of his career in the Pacific, including tours in Southeast Asia. And if I wanted to get a quick read on something without actually bothering Secretary Powell, I'd call Larry Wilkerson, someone who had served in Southeast Asia. If it was a military issue, a Defense Department issue, I could call Paul Wolfowitz. And so this was an unusual set of circumstances. And so while I was there, I never felt that Southeast Asia was getting short shrift. Now, none of us during those years traveled as much to Southeast Asia as we normally would have wanted to. Again, because we were prosecuting the war, and we were our battle station, if you will. I don't want to sound too dramatic. Our station was Washington. We're supposed to be running things there, and so probably I did not go to the region half as much as I would have otherwise, or maybe a third as much. But I thought the region got a high priority. That said, it was an unusual lineup. And quite frankly, one of the reasons I decided to retire from the service when I did was that I knew after the 2004 elections, I'd be working for different people. And I wouldn't have the same kind of, alignment of the stars above me that I had when I was there. And I just figured, hey, it's time to move on. So one, that was not my experience, but two, if you were to suggest to me that my experience was somewhat anomalous, I'd have to agree with you. And so I think, yes, Southeast Asia, is not the highest American priority. Certainly it's not the highest American priority in the Obama administration. But there it is. The focus will inevitably be first on China, Northeast Asia, China, Japan, Korea, and then on Southeast Asia and the interaction between Southeast Asia and the rest of the region. Now, I think the career people in the region understand that. One of the realities in life is that a small country is not going to get the same amount of attention from the United States as they would like. And people know that. I mean, it's just a fact of life. And I don't think it's going to be that hard for us to give the necessary amount of attention to Southeast Asia. Now, one of the good things about the Obama administration was that the president had lived as a child in Indonesia and plausibly could advance an Asian and a Pacific cultural background and perspective that previous presidents did not necessarily have. And, in the future, hopefully we will have administrations that pay the requisite amount of attention to Southeast Asia. And I think, I hope we have administrations that will tone down the hectoring that we sometimes engage in under both political parties, and be perhaps a little bit more respectful as we make our case. And usually our cases have a lot of merit, but as I say, sometimes we adopt an unnecessarily condescending or hectoring tone.
Did you feel that the people that you were working with on the ground, since you weren't able to get out there so often on your own, the people who were out there, the ambassadors, the staff, did you feel like they gave you a good assessment of what was going on?
Yes. By and large, yes. There were relatively few policy disputes that were of consequence. I can't recall a time when an ambassador sent a message to a senior State Department official, or to the White House for that matter, taking exception to their instructions. Sometimes they didn't like them, and there would be some grumbling and back and forth on the telephone. And sometimes an ambassador or other official in the field would pick up the telephone and say, "Hey, you've told us to do X, Y, and Z. That's not the best way to do it. Let's do C, D, and E instead, and see what happens," and convince us that was a better way to proceed. But no, I thought that there was a faithful effort made in the field to implement policy. There's a story which I do not believe is apocryphal that Secretary Powell once was asked, what's the difference between being here in the State Department and being a senior official at DOD? And his response was something to the effect that, well, here people are much more likely to carry out your orders and don't push back as much. And you have to be careful about what you say, because somebody will take that as a mandate, as an order to go ahead and do something. And I said the battles in the Pentagon were much more difficult, and things were not as settled as easily or as with the finality that an outsider would expect. I think that the department, by and large, is a pretty disciplined place.
Now, earlier you had mentioned that there were some run-ins with some staff and secretary at the Defense Department. In terms of your counterpart in the Defense Department, for what you had to do between 2001 and 2004, was there a lot of differences, or was there by and large agreement?
I was very lucky in that the person in the Pentagon with whom I had the most dealings was then a Marine colonel by the name of John Allen, who later became a 4-star general and is now the administration's point person for trying to deal with the mess in the Middle East. And I would say that John and I had a close working relationship, and we just about invariably came out in the same place on policy. Occasionally, he might want to do something in a different way than I would advocate doing it. And on one occasion, John asked me to hold off on doing something so that he could try to clean up. It was a real sloppy situation. That was not by the way of his making. And he was taken aback when he found out about it. And he asked me not to do anything for at least 24 hours. And implicitly also asking me not to inform my superiors about it for 24 hours. And I did. I said, okay, but this has to be dealt with. And he agreed with me on the substance, but he wanted to do it his way, and he dealt with it effectively.
So I gather you're not going to go into specifics.
No, I'm not going to go into specifics, but he dealt with it effectively, and the concerns I had, which he fully shared. I mean, at first when I told him what the problem was, I think John got very irritated with me, and he thought I was making a bad joke. And when I told him, John, listen, I'm not joking, John. This is for real. And he was. His reaction on the other end of the secure line was just audible. But he immediately understood what had to be done. And it was, as I say, he wanted to take responsibility for doing it himself, and I agreed.
What about your working relationship with people at the NSC who are in charge of Asia?
Oh, we tried to keep them from going operational and tried to keep them focused on policy, and really loved it when they came up with, you know, good ideas and could help secure funding. For example, I mentioned that I think Karen Brooks deserves a lot of credit for the idea of funding secular curricula at pesantren's in Indonesia. I think that was a wise long-term strategy for us. Obviously, it you know, it didn't have any direct impact in the short term, although I think it did cause the religious communities in Indonesia to appreciate that American interests were not simply in kinetic approaches to dealing with the world of Islam, that we were a lot more nuanced and subtle and constructive than they may have believed. And so there was that, I think, a spillover benefit. But, you know, for the most part, the State Department, as a rule, does not want to have the NSC directly mucking about. We want the NSC to, you know, be a, oh, I shouldn't say we. Many people in the department want to see the NSC be the honest broker in interagency disputes, keep the president informed about what's going on so that he or she is not blindsided, but tend to feel queasy when the NSC assumes an operational role.
For an outsider like me, I'm not quite sure what that means. What does it mean that the NSC tries to assume an operational role? What is an operational role?
Well, I'll send you Ali Noor's autobiography. For example, the dealing directly with foreign officials and not informing the Defense Department or the State Department or the CIA. That would be something that no cabinet agency would welcome.
And do they do that? Do they try to do that?
Oh, sure. Yeah, look at you know, the case of one NSC official had a direct secure line to Stanley McChrystal's office in Afghanistan.
But in the case of Southeast Asia, did that happen?
Oh, sure, it's happened from time to time. Yeah, it happens from time to time, I think, every place in the world, because there's it's very hard for NSC staffers not to want to engage, and, you know, just to write briefing memos for the president can get to be pretty dull stuff after a while.
But was it ever really an issue for you, or not so much?
Not so much, no.
Another criticism of the U.S. approach to Southeast Asia during the Bush administration was that the U.S. tended to focus on bilateral relations, bilateral cooperation, rather than multilateral forums. Do you think there's any basis for that sort of criticism?
Yes, although I think it could also be overdrawn. At the time, ASEAN as an institution, as a multilateral forum, was very much a work in progress. And trying to get ASEAN to take a position on any major key issue that went beyond the most platitudinous expressions conceivable was just about impossible. That wasn't going to happen. And so our focus certainly was on the individual relationships. That said, I think we were unnecessarily slow in committing ourselves to participate in some of the other activities in the region. I had a conversation once with Bob Zellick about, can we get the president to become engaged in this summit process? And he said, nah, you're not going to get him to travel to Asia that much. I think we were slow to sign up with, I'm embarrassed. I'm drawing a blank on the name of the accord that ASEAN has with other states.
It's
and
not
for
the ASEAN Regional Forum?
well, the ASEAN Regional Forum was an outgrowth of this. There's an ASEAN compact to which outside states can subscribe, and we refused to because we argued that the vagueness of the wording might inhibit our ability to move nuclear weapons around the region. Well, that was more of a Defense Department concern than a State Department concern. But frankly, by the time of Bush 43, we had stopped putting nuclear weapons on surface warships. And so what's the big deal? And we finally did accede to it. But even today, the ASEAN fora, the ASEAN Regional Forum, there's a very extensive menu of meetings, are not key places for decision making. And the basic consensus rule means that you're not going to get decisions on important issues because one of the 10 countries almost inevitably is going to be enticed or pressured into objecting. For example, getting a strong statement out of ASEAN regarding China's activities in the South China Sea. It's not going to happen. So, yeah, I know people say that we focus too much on bilateral relationships, and it's fair to say that we do focus on bilateral relationships, but it's not to the exclusion of the multilateral aspects. I think if you look at what one can expect out of the multilateral fora, the best you can say is that they remain a work in progress. Now, from an American perspective, from a different perspective, I think it's important to give ASEAN credit for developing the patterns of cooperation that have greatly reduced tensions between the various countries. Remember when ASEAN got started, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia were at daggers drawn. There were territorial conflicts between them, the Philippines. The Confrontasi era was very much an important factor. And ASEAN smothered a lot of that regional tension and conflict to the point now where it's, except for, I don't know, maybe something happening on the Thai-Cambodian border regarding a disputed Wat, it's hard to think of an armed conflict breaking out now within ASEAN. It would take something weird at this point for that to happen. And ASEAN as an institution gets part of the credit for that. And I think ASEAN as an institution also gets some of the credit for pulling the Burmese regime out of its shell and saying, guys, there's a better way to do this. And look at how we handle the United States.
Post-2004, which is of course when you left office, but post-2004, people have pointed out that, and I'm finishing up, pointed out that U.S. interest in Southeast Asia really sort of fell precipitously. When Dr. Rice became the NSC director and became the Secretary of State. And she didn't attend a lot of these forums that we talked about. And so some people have looked at that and said, well, there you go. That's evidence that the U.S. was only interested in Southeast Asia, or mainly interested in Southeast Asia because of counterterrorism. And once that was more or less successful, the interest shifted away. What would you have to say to that?
I think that's flat out wrong. I think the Secretary Rice was, as far as I know, always oriented towards the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. That was her professional career. Mm-hmm. She never evinced any particular interest in Asia except as a function of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. Whereas Secretary Powell and other people on his team, and Paul Wolfowitz, did have an interest in Asia. And so personalities matter in foreign policy. And I think the drop-off of perceived interest in Southeast Asia had less to do with policy in that circumstance than it did with personality.
So looking back, if you had a chance to do things over again in Southeast Asia, in your position, what would you have done differently?
I think I would have played a more active role in trying to run the trap lines in Congress on Burma. In our Burma policy, we made a major effort to work with the Burmese government at one point on the counter-narcotics issue. By way of background, Burma had been on our bad guys list for quite some time. And when the Bush administration came into office, they succeeded in having the Congress change the law to lower the threshold to designate a country as cooperating. And the reason they did that had nothing to do with Burma, but it was to try and be able to say that Mexico was cooperating with our efforts. And to get off the bad guy list, all you had to do was be in a circumstance where the regime was not demonstrably failing to cooperate. Well, the Burmese actually had done quite a few positive steps, and we were trying to get to the point where we could have serious discussions with them and show that by doing that we could accomplish American foreign policy objectives. And we thought that the Burmese actually did quite a bit on that, but there was such political resistance to saying anything nice about Burma that we got clobbered. And I did not myself fully appreciate the depth of that resistance. And certainly the people responsible for congressional relations and so forth, as we went down that road, I don't think appreciated it. And had I been better informed, I'm not sure what I would have done, but I would have been tempted perhaps just to let Burma stew in its own juices and not make an effort on it, or alternatively to make more of an effort to inform the administration, look, if we're going to do this, when I say inform the administration, we had a deputies meeting which approved doing all of this. But I probably would have stressed how hard it would be domestically, not internationally. Mm-hmm. And so I think, again, I said Burma was the one area of policy where I agreed there was no disagreement over goals and objectives, but certainly how we went about doing things was lamentable, and that's the one thing I'd like to be able to do over again. The rest of it, we made minor mistakes here and there. I don't think as a rule we made major mistakes. and we did a lot of very good work.
And so you're pleased, you said earlier that, you know, when 9/11 happened, you realized, okay, it's a whole new ball game.
Yeah.
And you feel that the United States played that new ball game well then?
We played it, I think we played it well, and I think if you look at the circumstances in Southeast Asia at the end of the game, things were in pretty good shape. We had made a lot of progress, not just on our counter-terrorist activities, although certainly there's demonstrable progress on those. We had significantly improved our relationship with Indonesia. Thailand was was more of a democratic polity and governance system than it had ever been. The Philippines, I can't say we made a lot of progress there, but that took a changing Philippine government, and when they changed their government, they started, you know, they've done very well lately under their new administration. We improved our relations with Vietnam. I think we improved our relations with Singapore, Malaysia. And so by and large, I would say in Southeast Asia, some might say that would have happened had we just sat on our hands and did nothing, or it happened in spite of us. I don't know. One can always make those arguments, but objectively, looking at the circumstances that prevailed, I think it's a good accomplishment.
Right, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.